is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. The impact of America's $1.5 trillion in student loan debt makes a lot of headlines. But one team of reporters have dug into a little-known corner of the student debt market and discovered a pattern of rule evading and abuses that is destroying the educational opportunities and careers of tens of thousands of Americans. Sarah Butrymowicz and Meredith Kolodner of the Hechinger Report's investigation team are here to share insights from their new series, Hidden Debt. Sarah, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Meredith, we're very pleased to have you back with us as well.
Thanks very much, Emily.
Well, I'm delighted to have a chance to talk to the dynamic duo of investigative reporting and higher ed again. It's a pleasure to have you both back here. Sarah, let's start with some important background. What is the 90-10 rule?
So the 90-10 rule is a federal regulation that says that only 90% of a for-profit college's revenue can come from federal financial aid. And the other 10% has to come from other sources. So that can be from private student loans, from students paying directly out of pocket. But the idea is just that a for-profit school cannot be getting all of its revenue from the federal government.
Was that to create some sort of buy-in on the part of the for-profit that they're investing in their own students?
The idea was partly to make sure that the for-profits were able to get students who kind of had to get skin in the game in another way, not just, Pell Grants and federal loans that have lower interest rates. And that if they couldn't attract students who were willing to give some of their own money, maybe they didn't deserve to exist.
So this sounds like it was an idea for consumer protection, that it was supposed to protect the students from bad actors. But what your story seems to show is that's really backfired.
Yes. So what we found in this story was that a lot of for-profit colleges and universities were turning to offering their own loans to students because whatever money the students paid back on those loans could count towards that 10%. So very often we found several examples of schools offering loans and knowing that they were going to write a lot of those off or sell them to debt collectors, that students were not going to be able to repay them. But whatever money they got back helped to get them to that 10% and then allowed them to, get that much more lucrative 90% of their revenue in federal aid.
Meredith, you interviewed Kashia Campbell. She was an older student who had gone to school at Florida Career College, a for-profit program. Tell us a little bit about her.
Sure. She went to school to become a patient care technician. It's something that she was interested in because her mother had been a healthcare worker as well. You can get a good job. So she went to the school. She graduated. She got really good grades. And when she went to sit for the exam so she could get certified, she was told, "I'm sorry, you can't take the exam. We need your transcript." It turned out that the college was withholding her transcript because of a $6,500 loan she had taken out. And even though she had been making payments, they said that they needed the entire loan paid off before she could get her transcript. So that meant that she couldn't take the exam, which would have allowed her to get a well-paying job that would have given her a chance of paying off that loan. So instead, she's been unemployed for the last year. She pays about $50 each month towards that loan. And she just assumes that she'll never be able to work in the field, so she's looking for work elsewhere, and she regrets ever having signed up in the first place.
You wrote, and I'm quoting here, Campbell's loan is a tiny fraction of the more than $30 million owed to Florida Career College's parent company, the International Education Corporation. The company doesn't care whether she and thousands of others ever pay it back. Why don't they care?
It all comes down to 90-10 again. By getting a student like Kashia in the door, they're getting access to all her federal money, which is really their main source of revenue. And so as long as some students are paying something back, it's enough to keep them in line with federal regulations. And if a student like Kashia isn't able to pay her full amount, then it's just written off as a loss. It's just part of doing business for them.
And if you think about it, let's say somebody gets a $1,000 loan and they're able to bring in $9,000 in federal funding, whether it's aid or federal loans. Even if that company never sees that $1,000 because the student can't pay it back, it still gets that $9,000, so it comes out ahead.
There's a lot in this story that kind of stunned me. And I think one of the things here was just how high the interest rates can be on these loans by these schools. Unlike federal student loans, you write, which have interest rates of 2.75% for undergraduate borrowers, you looked at a 2020 report which found that at some schools it could be as high as 19%. I got to ask, how is that legal?
So these essentially are private loans. And so some states will have caps on how much interest you can charge on a private loan. But as long as you're operating within that, the schools really can do whatever they want. So we did find multiple examples of interest rates in the double digits. And, again, there's very loose regulation around these loans. I did a survey of all 50 states trying to find what agencies, if any, were monitoring this, collecting information on it, and making sure that schools that were operating as lenders were following laws. And what I found is there basically isn't any oversight, with few exceptions. And schools often don't even need to tell anyone if they're operating as a lender. And what I heard from most agencies was, well, if someone brought to our attention that they were breaking the law about how they were offering their loans, we could go after them. But that's it. So as long as they're staying within state guidelines for what a maximum interest rate can be, they can pretty much do whatever they want.
Sarah, you also interviewed a student, and that was Jody Ann Clark. Tell us about her.
Jody Ann went to a school called Lincoln Tech back in 2012. She wanted to be a licensed nurse practitioner. She took out a loan from the school because her program cost over $30,000, which was just far more than federal aid was going to cover, and she couldn't afford to pay that difference out of pocket. And she had to start paying her loan right away when she was in school, and the interest began accruing right away. So unlike a federal loan where interest does not accrue when you're in school, you even get a grace period after you graduate before you have to start paying it off, she was sort of hit with those payments right from the beginning.
How did you pick these students to be representative of this crisis? So we've got Lincoln Tech, which is in Connecticut, and then, of course, we have the Florida College. How did you find these students?
Yeah, as Sarah was saying, there's not very much oversight into these types of loans. But one of the things that students can do is file complaints with their state agencies. And in this case, with Kashia, she made a complaint to the Florida Attorney General's office. So we put in a Freedom of Information Act request, and we got several complaints that students had made about several universities and colleges. And because in Florida, like in other states, they will just give you those complaints with the names, we called them, and that's how we found them.
So if I'm an education reporter and I'm listening to this, is my next stop to do an open records request to my own state agency to see who's complained?
Not all states will give you the complaint with the name attached to it, but there are several that will. And so absolutely filing FOIAs with state agencies or attorney general's offices, depending on what kind of complaints you're looking for, is a great way to find people. And it's also a great way to find the scope or at least some of the individual issues that people are facing that you might not know about.
When you started to get a sense of the scope of this problem and you reached out to federal education officials for reaction response, what did you get?
The Federal Department of Education said that it wasn't anything that they tracked or anything that they had any oversight. So they basically said, we can't tell you anything about it.
I guess if it's not their purview, it's not their purview, but who's out there then to protect these students?
That's something that people, experts who follow this issue, are pretty concerned about, that they say that there really isn't. So at the federal level, there are a few different agencies who could potentially investigate these loan programs or even theoretically require schools to submit information about them, the Department of Education being one, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau being another. They gave us some information about, they have sort of taken action against 3 schools since they were created. I believe it was in 2011. And that action included things about their loan programs and alleged problems with them. But some folks are saying that they haven't gone far enough and there's really room for them to do much more.
There are some organizations out there who are keeping an eye on this and trying to shed light on it. One is the Century Foundation, a progressive think tank. And you mentioned that they obtained several company audits for these for profit colleges and shared them with you and the New York Times, who was your publication partner for this story. Will they share those with anybody who asks? Again, if I'm an education reporter, can I get in touch with the Century Foundation and ask them to share what they've got?
They might. The Century Foundation was very generous by sharing these audits with us. What's kind of funny about it, and I do think that this is helpful for reporters in general, is that we actually called the Century Foundation to talk to them about a different story, which was about for profits that were growing in the midst of the pandemic. And as we were talking about that, we just brought off the issue of institutional loans, and they said, oh, you should check out these audits. There might be something in there. And when we looked through the audits, indeed, there were some that actually did include their loan programs and how much they were owed and some of the terms of the loans.
So I want to encourage people who are listening to go take a look at the Hidden Death series, but also at some related coverage by both these reporters and also others at the Hechinger report, including a recent story by John Marcus, who wrote about students whose transcripts were being held up for owing back payments on tuitions. And that was another really troubling piece of this puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we first started looking at that issue, one of the things I was hearing was that from professors was that they had students who couldn't register for classes because they had an unpaid balance, so they couldn't move on with their education. And then one step beyond that is students who could not obtain their transcripts, so they cannot transfer, they can't register for new classes, and they ultimately can't graduate, even though they've completed all of their credits. Once you can't get your transcript, it really hinders you in terms of getting jobs or if you want to move on with your education anywhere. And that amount, sometimes the students could owe as little as $25 and then maybe even $100. But once you can get into a cycle where some of the colleges or the debt collection agencies will charge interest, and so you have something that starts at $100 and ends up at 500. And once you start going down that road, it's really hard to get out of that cycle and pay back that money.
One thing I think your project and your series really gets across is this idea of it's not a monolith. The people who owe money, who get into these dire straits, they're very much individuals, and there are a lot of different discrete groups here. And another discrete group, which is separate from the sort of like general idea of student loan debt, and that's parents. Meredith, can you talk a little bit about the Parent Plus program?
Yeah, so the Parent Plus program is a set of federal loans that if your child cannot cover the full cost of tuition using the student federal loans, then the parent can take out money to bridge that cost. And initially, that program was set up for more affluent parents. It wasn't used very broadly. It was just if you needed something to tide you over, and the loans were paid back pretty quickly. But as the cost of education has skyrocketed, more and more parents and families have had to get those, you could call it sort of a bridge loan, to take out money to help their children pay for their education. And what was stunning to me about this issue, not only was it middle income and low income families that were borrowing, but they were borrowing for their children to go in state to public universities. So these were not children that were going to very expensive private colleges. They had really done the right thing. They had done really well in high school. They got into either their flagship or another public university. They're in state, they're working hard. Some of them are working jobs while they're in college, and they still can't afford to pay. And so their parents end up taking on debt. The interest rates are much higher, and you have parents who are facing debt. Some of the people I talked to said they just expected to die with that debt. There's no way they can ever pay it off. In some cases, the parents are not only paying their own student loans off, but also the Parent Plus loans for their children. And they're just facing such impossible hurdles. I know sometimes people say, oh, well, you took out this loan, you have to pay it back. And I think the people I spoke to said, absolutely, I want to pay this back. It's the interest that's killing me. And also, what was I supposed to do? How else do I get my kid to a financial future that's more stable than the one I had? I thought sending them to college was the way to do that. Most people would kind of do anything for their kids, and then they end up in real financial dire straits.
We're talking with Sarah Butrymowicz and Meredith Kolodner of the Hechinger Report about the hidden student debt in higher education. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thanks to everyone who has taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and feedback are helping us to grow. We've talked some about what you uncovered in your reporting. I also want to dig a little bit more into how you did it. Sarah, was there a really big hurdle that you encountered here for this story?
There were a couple things that proved to be very difficult about this story. One is the fact that it's hidden, right? That's why we are calling it part of our Hidden Debt Trap series. But we first started just asking questions about institutional loans when we, in the course of reporting on other for-profit institutions, had, read a fair number of settlements that these schools have had with federal and state agencies over all sorts of allegations that kind of had nothing to do with these loans. But these settlements would often include something about how much money a school was agreeing to forgive. And so that sort of raised some questions for us. And we started asking higher education experts who are often really tuned in to what's happening in the for-profit world and in the higher ed policy world. And we found some people who had a lot of insight into what was going on. And we also found some people who said, I have no idea. So it wasn't just something that we could kind of, go to some of our usually most helpful folks and kind of quickly get our head around. We found that it really was quite hidden and uncovered. And then the audits that the Century Foundation very kindly shared with us were really what broke the story open for us, because they were a chance for us to, for individual schools, be able to say things about how big their loan program was, how much they thought they were going to get repaid. In some cases, the interest rates are in there. We had this collection of schools that we had some concrete details for that they weren't, putting online on their About Us page. But we are not finance reporters. So it really did take a lot of time and Googling and talking to sources sort of outside the higher ed world, but who knew finance, to make sure that we were understanding all of this and interpreting it correctly so we could go forth and report the rest of the story.
What's been the response to the stories? I imagine there have been people reaching out, maybe wanting to offer help or assistance, particularly to the folks that you featured who are in these really terrible circumstances.
We have heard from people who were really moved by Kashia's story and wanted to know about if they could help her at all. It really did seem to resonate with people that there was something inherently unfair about the situation that she was in, and they wanted to try to help make it right. That's been the biggest response.
I'm wondering, do you read the comments on your stories, especially when they're cross-posted on a platform as big as the New York Times?
I skimmed the comments, very briefly. I would not say I generally try not to read them all.
Well, I asked because I was skimming them myself, and a lot of people seem to be saying some version of, caveat emptor, that these students should have been aware of the fine print on what they were signing. But I think your stories help to make it clear that there's fine print and then there's minuscule print and misleading print.
Right. That's something we hear a lot when we report on for-profit schools and debt is, what did this student think they were getting into? But I think what we try to do with our stories is really look at the whole system. So this is an issue with regulation, that no one is watching these schools, so they can take advantage of this. And when they are pitching these loans to students, they might be saying one thing, but the thing they're telling their investors is very different about it. So I hope by breaking that down a little bit, it kind of extends the conversation beyond just this issue of personal responsibility.
Is this an equity issue too? I mean, because certainly we know that students of color are often more likely to get locked into these bad loans and to attend for-profit institutions that have worse career payoffs.
Yeah, I think it is an equity issue. I know that sometimes people say, well, you signed this, you have to pay it back. But I would hope that people can put themselves in situations, either if they have gone to college or if they haven't, and think about what it's like. If you don't know many people who have gone to college, you walk into a college admissions office, somebody says to you, you have a really bright future. All you have to do is go to college. for a year, you can make $50,000, $60,000 a year. You'll absolutely be able to pay off these loans. Just sign these sets of papers. And I think all of us could look back and think about things that we've signed that might be 20 pages long, and whether or not we've found every single minuscule detail in there that would tell us everything that we've just signed. And to that extent, I do think it's about regulation and making sure that you're presenting the information in a way that students understand what they're signing, what they're going to have to pay, and what the consequences are if they don't pay. I have spoken to a lot of students who that was absolutely not clear to them when they entered into these loans.
What do we know about how oversight of for-profit colleges and these kinds of loans might change with the new presidential administration? Biden has suggested it's going to be a more activist Consumer Finance Protection Bureau.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what ends up happening. I mean, right now, the conversation is dominated, and rightly so, by the federal loan crisis. And people are talking about loan forgiveness, canceling the debt of people who have defaulted, or at least putting a moratorium on current payments under COVID. But I haven't seen anyone talking about this type of student debt, which is the type of loans that you take out directly from colleges that are largely unregulated, that don't show up in the federal debt statistics. And that, as we found out, as we were talking to experts, we had several people say to us, no, I don't think this is something that happens. And so not only is there not oversight, but if lots of people don't even know that it's going on, I think that's part of why there's no proposal to try to change the situation.
We've talked about a couple of story ideas for local reporters who may be inspired by what you two have done. Sarah, I'm wondering if there's another story you'd love to see local and regional reporters tackling on this debt question.
Yeah, I think it's worth asking if any for profit colleges in your area have these programs. And if they do, asking them questions about how they work and why they do it. And I think there's huge opportunity to localize what we've done. And it's similar to the issue that Meredith was talking about earlier about transcripts being withheld at public institutions. That's a story that we tackled somewhat nationally with a bit of a focus of Massachusetts, but it's going on everywhere. So I think there's questions that reporters can be asking from the colleges and universities closest to them, regardless of what sector they're in, about students owing them money and what that looks like.
Meredith, how about you? Story idea?
Yeah, I mean, one of the frustrating things about reporting this story was doing it from our apartment, just like everybody else has been doing over the last year. And I think that if you are located in an area where there is one of these colleges, Florida Career College, any of the large for-profits, to be able to have those local sources, and maybe when things open up, to be able to go and talk to students who are on campuses, you will find out so much of what is going on inside that college, which in some cases we weren't able to really get to the meat of how many people at Florida Career College, for instance, or wherever you are in this dire situation. We were going through complaints and things like that to get to people. But, if you're local, you have local sources, you're going to be able to find this happening in your state, I would imagine.
So, Meredith, I'm going to give you the last word. Any parting advice for reporters?
I would just say don't get sidetracked by people who are saying, no, this isn't a problem, this doesn't exist. It's not that you shouldn't listen to the experts, but sometimes even the experts aren't fully aware of everything that's happening below a radar. And the other thing I would say is, I know as education reporters, we often get intimidated by finance or by math, and it can be intimidating to go down the road of something that feels like a business story. But I would say that there are a lot of people willing to talk to you about the ins and outs of these audits. Not everyone fully understands them, but we even leaned on non-traditional sources like former and current Wall Street analysts who are often willing to talk to you and will explain some of the detail of business, for-profit education, and the SEC documents that you might need to wade through to do some of these stories.
That's great advice, Meredith. Thank you. Sarah Butrymowicz is Senior Editor for Investigations. Meredith Kolodner is a Senior Investigative Reporter. They are both with the Hechinger Report. Thank you both for making time for EWA Radio.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporters you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.